Welcome everyone to the 8th Annual Rise Above Research Conference, and I'm so pleased to introduce our faculty lecture presenter today. These lectures, like the work of our students who've been presenting all day today, are just a small snapshot of a much longer labor of love. High quality research takes hours, days, and sometimes years to culminate in a presentation that lasts just mere minutes. Today's speaker, Dr. Kellie Brown, has been a longtime member of Milligan University. She's part of the music faculty. She started here in 1998 and is the chair of the music department, professor of music, and a conductor of the Milligan Orchestra. She studied violin performance and music education at Furman University and East Tennessee State University, where she received her bachelor's degree in music education. She also holds a master's degree in violin performance from Appalachian State University and a doctoral degree in higher education administration from East Tennessee State University. Dr. Brown is going to be sharing her research today from her recently published book titled The Sound of Hope: Music as Solace, Resistance, and Salvation During the Holocaust and World War II. While this topic can be heartbreaking, remembering and celebrating the lives of those lost through genocide can be a step toward healing. That is our theme for the conference this year, which is one of the reasons why we asked her to do this talk. So join me in listening to Dr. Brown as she tells us more about her research.
Thank you, Dr. Drennan. I really appreciate the opportunity to be part of this important conference. I always love to have my students present at it, and I'm happy to give the faculty lecture this year. Well, for almost 20 years, you're talking about how much, research happens. So for almost 20 years, I've been researching music's role during the Holocaust, and I've been trying to uncover and bring together the stories of people and places and objects. And I've discovered incredible stories of how music has been used for solace and for spiritual resistance and for even reconciliation. And I've also discovered the horrible ways in which the Nazis used music to torture and to manipulate, and how it became a cog in the machinery of genocide. But overall in my research, it's confirmed that music is incredibly powerful and that it can speak for us when we have no words, that it can tenderize our hearts, and that in the hands of evil people, its power can be wielded as a weapon. So tonight, I'm going to talk a bit about people and places and objects that I've written about. And I want to focus that within the context of 4 words that I think connect my research so well to this conference's theme of toward healing. And I really like the fact that it says toward healing. It's not like that healing is something that we arrive at and it's completed, mission accomplished, and we check it off a to-do list, but that healing is a process, something that we strive again each day. And so these 4 words to think about are remembrance, resistance, resilience, and reconciliation. So I'm going to share my screen here. And last Thursday was Holocaust Remembrance Day, or what is known in Hebrew as Yom HaShoah. When these official remembrance days come around, then we have to figure out how we hold space for memory. How do we do that? On Yom HaShoah, a lot of people light a yellow candle, and that yellow candle symbolizes that yellow star of David that the Jews were forced to wear. So what else can we do? Do you know that if we held 10 seconds of silence for every victim of the Holocaust, that we would be silent for over 5 years? So how does Israel, a country who is so intimately connected and affected by the Holocaust, how do they hold space? Well, in Israel, on Yom HaShoah, there is a moment during the day in which a piercing siren is sounded for 2 minutes and everything stops. If you're driving on the freeway, you stop your car. The trains stop. People in the street stop. People in the grocery store stop. Everything ceases. And for 2 minutes, there's complete stillness as people pause in a powerful collective demonstration of memory and how that their lives have been irrevocably changed by the Holocaust. And that's an example of a nationwide response. But what about an individual Holocaust survivor or a family member of a Holocaust survivor? I'd like to share a quote with you about memory made by Dr. Edith Egger, who was sent to Auschwitz when she was 16 years old. She was sent there along with her mother and her sister. Her mother was murdered the same day that they arrived. She and her sister survived, and this is what she says. Memory is sacred ground, but it's haunted too. It's the place where my rage and guilt and grief go circling like hungry birds, scavenging the same old bones. It's the place where I go searching for the answer to the unanswerable question, why did I survive? Resistance. While there are many examples of actual physical resistance during the Holocaust, like the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, what I'm referring to is spiritual resistance. The refusal to let your mind, your heart, or your soul be defeated by those who intend you harm. The act of creating beauty amid ugliness. The act of preserving one's culture in the face of an enemy who desires to wipe you off the face of the earth. Victor Ullmann, who was a Czech composer who was imprisoned in the camp Terezín, said this, "By no means did we sit weeping on the banks of the waters of Babylon. Our endeavor with respect to arts was commensurate with our will to live." The Czech pianist Alice Herz-Sommer, who was also in that same camp, said, "Music was life. We did not, could not, would not give up." Then resilience. This is a word that we hear tossed around a lot. We've heard it a lot during this pandemic. What does it really mean? Well, according to the Merriam-Webster dictionary, resilience is an ability to recover from or adjust easily to misfortune or change. Holocaust survivor Viktor Frankl posed the challenge of resilience as this: continuing to live despite persistent world weariness. That definition connects to me on a much deeper level. And it certainly wasn't easy for Frankl to continue to live after what had been done to him in Auschwitz and after his mother and father and brother had been murdered. Here's another example of resilience, more words from Edith Egger. "I will always be a woman whose mother and father were gassed and burned and turned to smoke. I will always be what every person is, someone who will bear suffering. We can't erase the pain, but we are free to accept who we are and what has been done to us and move on." That is resilience. And then finally, reconciliation. This may be the most challenging of all. After all of the atrocities in this dark chapter of human history, how could there be reconciliation? And I'm going to try to offer one possible avenue at the end of this presentation. So for the next few minutes, as we look at some stories of people and places and objects, I invite you to hold space for how remembrance and resistance and resilience and reconciliation might emerge. So here are some objects to consider: an accordion, a guitar, a piece of music written on a scrap of paper, a violin, a conductor's baton, a cello, and a piano. All of these objects will find themselves in horrible places, such as Auschwitz and Terezín and POW camps, and they will find themselves in the hands of innocent people who had become the targets of hate. And so I want us to explore what happens to these objects and to these people when they come together in these places. So Auschwitz is, of course, one of the most infamous places in all of human history, a place of torture and depravity and murder. It was also a place where music was performed daily. The Nazis forced prisoners in large concentration camps to perform music. Orchestras where prisoners performed at gunpoint were not uncommon. You see them here in this photo. This is the men's orchestra at Auschwitz. There were actually 3 orchestras in this camp, including the only all-female orchestra in the whole camp system. So why would something like this exist? Well, there are many reasons. First, the Germans loved music and they wanted to be surrounded by it. So these groups served as entertainment for their captors. But their main function was to provide marching music for the fellow prisoners to go to and from their work details in the morning and the evening. So this orchestra functioned as one of the mechanisms that accomplished the Nazi agenda. You can imagine that this didn't make them very popular among their fellow captives, who would often hurl insults at them. But these people you see sitting here were as helpless as any other prisoner. They had to play or be killed. Alma Rosé was an incredibly talented violinist from Vienna, and she was right in the midst of a wonderful international career when she was sent to Auschwitz just because she was Jewish. And when she arrived there, she was sent to Block 10, which was the experimental medical block where Dr. Joseph Mengele was conducting his horrific experiments. And when she walked into that place and looked around, she thought, I'm going to die here. And she demanded that a violin be brought to her because she wanted the comfort of her music before she died. And even though she was a prisoner, she was well known. She was a celebrity, and indeed, a violin was brought to her. And she began to give nightly concerts in there for the women who were suffering through these horrible experiments. And in return, the prisoners who worked in the office made sure that her name did not end up on the experiment list. And so she used music to comfort them. But it didn't take long before her presence became known to Maria Mondel, who was the head SS of the women at Auschwitz. So in addition to a violin, Alma was given a baton, and she was assigned to conduct the women's orchestra, which you can see performing here for the prisoner marches. Alma soon realized that this group was different than the other orchestras in Auschwitz. Most of the women here were amateurs because only men were allowed to play in the professional orchestras during this time period. So the lack of a lot of accomplished musicians among the female prisoners meant that this orchestra was made up of sort of a hodgepodge of instruments. So things you wouldn't expect to find in an orchestra, like mandolins and guitars, alongside other orchestral instruments. And Alma soon discovered that she could save people's lives through the orchestra, if she could get them in the orchestra, and if she could help the orchestra to sound better. She really knew that their fate rested on their ability to play well and to please the SS. So she worked really hard to improve the orchestra. She also wanted to expand their repertoire so they weren't playing the same pieces over and over again. But there was no music that you could buy for this group. She had to write it all. So she often stayed up all night writing new arrangements. And in a short period of time, this group developed a repertoire of over 200 pieces. It's really unfathomable to think. And then she also realized that if the Nazis wanted this orchestra, which they did, that she could use that as leverage to get some things they needed, like extra food rations. So I wanted to tell you about two of the women that Alma helped save. As a teenager, Esther was sent to Auschwitz. And when Nazi officials wanted to put together this women's orchestra of prisoners, she was summoned to audition because they heard that she played the piano and that she could sing. But at this point, there wasn't a piano available, so they handed her an accordion. And they said, if you can play this, you can join the orchestra. Well, she had never held an accordion in her hands in her life. And they gave her 60 seconds to figure it out. And she did. She figured it out. She passed the audition, and she became a member of the orchestra. Anita also was sent as a teenager to Auschwitz. When she was going through the intake procedures where her head was being shaved and a number was being tattooed on her arm, the prisoner who was working on her asked what she did. And she said, I play the cello. And the prisoner, just to Anita's great surprise, said, well, fabulous, you'll be saved. And she was told to stand to the side. And she said she was standing there with her head shaved and she was completely naked. And an elegant woman began to come toward her. So the woman was a prisoner, but she was elegant, and said, do you indeed play the cello? And Anita says, yes, I do. And the woman said, my name is Alma Rosé, and you will be in the orchestra. And so that was an invitation to life. I'm happy to share with you that not only did Esther and her accordion survive the war, but she is still alive today, and she is still playing the accordion. She plays in a band called the Microphone Mafia. So she's really hip and cool with her accordion. She's 95 years of age. This past October, she received the Hermann Maas Prize for her life's work in pursuit of racial and social justice. And when she talks about her time in the orchestra, she reveals the most fundamental truth of what I learned in my research. As long as I play, I live. Anita also survived and is still alive. These two are the only women that I know who are still alive from this orchestra. She is also 95 years old and is so active in giving her testimony and reminding people that surviving is not always easy. The healing process is difficult. It is difficult to remember how you were forced to play music. And she describes it as we played with tears in our eyes and guns in our back. Their story is about remembrance and resistance and resilience and reconciliation. Now to a different place. Stalag VIIIA was a prisoner of war camp located on the border between Poland and Germany. It's about 50 miles east of Dresden. And here the Germans held many Allied troops who had been captured. One of the people there at Stalag VIIIA was a violinist named Max Becker. He had studied the violin at the Vilna Conservatory and then was drafted into the Polish army and then later captured. by the Germans. When he arrived at this POW camp, he discovered that there were other musicians there and that they were playing together to pass the time and to lift their own spirits and those of their fellow captives. And he wanted to audition for the orchestra, so he contacted the conductor, a Belgian prisoner named Ferdinand Karajan, who you see standing in the foreground of this photo next to Max. Max had actually managed to acquire the violin you see there through a kindly man he met while he was doing his work details. And upon auditioning for the conductor, he knew right away that he wanted Max to be his concertmaster. He was so talented. But he had to get special permission from the German commandant because Max was Jewish. The commandant gave permission, and Max became the first chair violinist of this POW orchestra. He also became its only Jewish member. And Max played with the orchestra for 2.5 years while he was a POW. And as the end of the war drew near and the Nazis realized that they were going to lose the war, they began to evacuate this camp. And they sent a lot of prisoners home. They just released them. But they wouldn't release Max because he was Jewish. And so he ended up as part of a death march until his starving group ran into some American soldiers who brought them to St. Ottilian. St. Ottilian was a Benedictine monastery and is today. It's about 35 miles outside of Munich. The Nazis had taken it over and turned it into a military hospital. And then when the war ended, about 400 survivors from Dachau that needed treatment were brought here. And so the US government decided to officially turn it into a displaced persons camp. At this camp, Max met other musicians, including Vanya Dermashkin, who was a talented pianist who had studied at the Vilna Conservatory, and she and her sister had been in the Dachau concentration camp. They had survived that. They had also survived a death march where they had been abandoned in the mountains to starve. And again, American troops discovered them and brought them to St. Ottilian. And so Max and Vanya fell in love there. And while healing was happening at St. Ottilian, there was also music. Max and Vanya and Henya met other musicians, and they joined together and they formed the ex-concentration camp orchestra. And at first they were giving concerts for those in the camp and the DP camp with them and the staff there. Then they began to travel. They dressed in some unusual uniforms. They wanted to remind everyone of what they had been living through. And they began to perform for American troops. They began to travel by bus to give concerts. They traveled to the Nuremberg Opera House to give a concert for those who were involved in the Nuremberg war crime trials. In 1948, a young 29-year-old Leonard Bernstein came to town and conducted 2 concerts with them, including with him at the piano playing Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue. This orchestra was never meant to be a long-term group. This was a transitional time for people who had lost their citizenship, their homelands, their family. And so in 1949, the group disbanded, and Max Becker and the Dermashkin sisters eventually immigrated to the United States. And Max and Vanya married and spent the rest of their lives in their adopted country. Their daughter, Sonia, is a very dear friend of mine, and I'm always honored to share the story of her parents. It's a story about remembrance and resistance and resilience and reconciliation. The next place is halfway around the world from the camps of Europe to the South Pacific. After the bombing of Pearl Harbor in December of 41, the Japanese army just began to quickly overtake all of the islands in the Pacific that were populated by a lot of Dutch and English colonists. And as the Japanese gained ground, people began to flee to Singapore because they always saw Singapore as this grand, impenetrable fortress. But by early February, it became clear that Singapore was going to fall to the Japanese. So the British government gave the order to evacuate English women and children and civilian men. And so they just assembled whatever cargo ships they could find and just poorly outfitted them with guns and loaded them up with people to try to get to England. Among the women and children on board were 2 English musicians. Nora Chambers was a violinist who had studied at the Royal Academy of Music in London. She was teaching violin lessons in Malaya when the war broke out. The other woman, Margaret Dryburgh, was an organist and a choir director, and she was serving as a Presbyterian missionary to the Chinese population in Singapore. So in February, Nora boarded a ship called the Viner Brook, and Margaret boarded a ship called the Matahari. But what these passengers didn't know was that it was too late. The British government had arrogantly thought that the Japanese could never conquer them and could never take Singapore, and so they had waited. And so by the time they finally ordered the evacuation, Japanese ship and aircraft were already in control of the waters, and they were lying in wait for these ships. Within 2 days, Nora's ship, the Viner Brook, was bombed by 6 Japanese aircraft, and they destroyed the lifeboats, and the passengers that were still left alive ended up in the water. And they were holding on to any debris they could find. Margaret's ship, the Matahari, was not bombed, but it was captured by a Japanese ship, and everyone aboard was taken prisoner. Now, the people who had ended up in the water began to float on the currents and to arrive on this little island called Bangka Island. Some of them, the fortunate ones, were able to wash ashore after only 8 hours. Some people were caught up in the currents and did not find land until about 60 hours. So Nora Chambers was among this group that eventually washed on shore. Then any of the others who had been captured on their ships were brought here. And the Japanese separated the women and children from the men, and they brought them over to Sumatra and formed a POW camp for the women and children. And they were subjected to horrific conditions, lack of food, unrelenting heat, tropical diseases like malaria that there was little or no medication for it. And, the daily problem was the lack of food. They were given very little, sometimes just a bag of dry rice that was also full of stones and glass. And so the women had to pick through the rice 1 grain at a time. As with the Nazi guards in German concentration camps, the Japanese were obsessed with counting the prisoners, a procedure known as tanko. The guards would blow a loud whistle, and the women were to run out and line up to be counted. And then they were to take a deep ceremonial bow that symbolized bowing to Emperor Hirohito. Many of the women recounted to survive this daily insult, they pretended to bow to their favorite composer or to bow to God, anything to help keep their mind in a different place. And so it was in this situation that these 2 musicians, Nora and Margaret, hatched this plan to bring music. Now, unlike in the Nazi camps where there were instruments available because the Nazis had, confiscated a lot of instruments and there was a big storehouse, but there was nothing here. So Margaret and Nora decided to form a vocal orchestra, something that you never heard of, singing orchestral music. And so it was all made possible by Margaret, who had an eidetic memory for music. She could have perfect recall of any piece she had heard. So she began to write down masterworks for 4 parts, like a choral ensemble, but there would be no words. The women would sing them with syllables, with oohs and ahs. So amid all of that suffering, Margaret was arranging music on little scraps of paper. You can see one of those that she wrote out here, the Largo from Dvorak's New World Symphony. And Nora recruited the singers and she rehearsed them. And it was a mixture of experienced and inexperienced singers. So the weak singers just stood next to the strong ones for help. But the Japanese had forbidden the women to congregate, and so they had to practice in secret at night by the light of a single bulb. And so in December of 1943, the group was ready to give its first concert. And it was a wonderful event, and the women and children just had their spirits lifted so much by the beautiful music that this vocal orchestra sang. And so as soon as the concert was over, they wanted to know when the next concert was going to be. And so Margaret set out to remember more pieces. And so they learned more songs and they gave more concerts. But in time, their conditions deteriorated further, and they had been in captivity for so long that many of the women and children began to die of disease and starvation. Nora did survive to see the liberation, but Margaret did not. Final place to consider tonight is in the former Czechoslovakia, known as Terezín in Czech. The Germans called it Theresienstadt. Terezín is located about 30 kilometers outside of Prague, and the Nazis technically labeled it a ghetto, but it functioned as a concentration camp. And it was a place where they particularly targeted to send Czech artists, Czech musicians, Czech members of the intelligentsia. And it was a horrific place, like all the others we are looking at, the same kinds of things: overcrowding, lack of food, lack of medicine, lack of basic necessities, and rampant disease. The people in Terezín also lived in daily fear of deportations because Terezín also functioned as a transit camp. So trains were leaving regularly from there to extermination camps like Treblinka and Auschwitz. And there was also music. There was music in Terezín, but it was different than the forced music labor that we see in a place like Auschwitz. At first, music making was actually forbidden, but the people still made music. They just did it in secret. I mean, the camp was full of professional performers and composers and conductors. To them, music was a necessity, and they had to make music. But in time, the Nazis thought, you know what, we can actually use this. We'll encourage some forms of music making, and we'll use it as propaganda. We'll use it, and they did. They fooled the Red Cross, and they fooled part of the world into thinking that the Jews of Europe were being treated well. One of the people making music in Terezín was Ilse Weber. Before the war, Ilse was a successful writer, a Czech writer of children's literature. She also composed songs and played string instruments like the guitar, the lute, and the mandolin. In 1942, when she was 39 years old, she was sent to Terezín along with her husband and her young son, Tomas. And in the letters she wrote during this time, she described living in Terezín as dancing on a powder keg. And she was assigned to be a night nurse in the children's infirmary. So she sat there at night and cared for the sick children. And while she sat there, she wrote poems and she composed songs, many of them lullabies that she would sing to the children. But this activity of singing to the children, of comforting the children, was forbidden in Terezín. So she did it at great risk. And yet she refused to withhold what comfort that she could give. One of the poems that she wrote in the camp is called Musica Prohibita. And it reads like this: I wander through Theresienstadt. A policeman's glance makes my flesh crawl. The loot I found is concealed, held tight, wrapped like an infant in a shawl. My heart beats fast, my cheeks are hot. I dread his probing eyes. If he discovered what I've got, they'll take the loot I prize. And then her poem concludes like this: music is a beatitude. It is there salvation lies. Fearlessly I tote my loot beneath the policeman's eyes. 2 years later, the Nazis announced that they were sending all of the sick children to Auschwitz. Rather than abandon them, she volunteered that she would go with them and her young son, and they were all murdered there on their arrival. Her husband, who survived, had hidden her poems and songs, and he was able after the war to retrieve them, and that's how we have them today. There's a line from another poem that I think really reveals the resistance and the resilience in the life of Ilse Weber. Let them try our spirits more. From the dust we shall arise. One of the most talented musicians in Terezín was Alice Herz-Sommer. She'd been a child prodigy, and like Alma Rose and so many others, she had been right in the prime of her career when her life was interrupted because of her Jewish heritage, and she was deported to Terezín along with her mother and her husband and her 6-year-old son named Rafi. And Alice became a very important musical figure in Terezín. She gave over 100 piano recitals, all from memory. She taught the children piano lessons in secret because educating them was forbidden. In the end, Alice's music actually saved her life and her son's life. One day, a guard came up to her and said, "I love your music, and when you play, I listen outside the window. Because of that, I have made sure that your name and your son's name are never on the deportation list." Tragically, Alice's mother and husband were both murdered in extermination camps. As we are looking at so many stories in which music helped those who were suffering, I think it's really important to note that music did not bring comfort to everyone. For some people, it had the opposite effect. The thing that was the most precious to them had been stolen from them. It had been tainted. Some who survived could never play music again. The joy of that gift was gone. There was one violinist in Auschwitz who was ordered to play the French national anthem while the guards were hanging a French prisoner. After that incident, he could not for days reconcile how his music had been used in that way, and he committed suicide. But Alice here not only survived, but she thrived. Upon her death in 2014, she was 110 years old. She was the world's oldest known Holocaust survivor, and she was still practicing the piano 3 hours a day from memory. And despite all that had been taken from her, Alice demonstrated incredible resilience. When asked how she had managed to do it all of these years, she would reply, "Life is beautiful. You have to be thankful that we are living. Wherever you look is beauty. I know about the bad things, but I look for the good things." In conclusion, I want to revisit the idea of holding space for memory that I mentioned at the beginning, and how that relates to the concept of inherited memory. The subject of inherited memory is something that's really important to the children and grandchildren of Holocaust survivors. These people are referred to as 2Gs and 3Gs, second generation survivors, third generation survivors, and they know that they are impacted by memories that they have inherited. There's a scientific field that studies this called epigenetics. Dr. Neerat Pisano is a psychiatrist who specializes in studying epigenetics, and she examines how we inherit genetic changes, not because the actual genetic code in our DNA has changed, but because the genetic expression, whether the gene is turned off or on, has changed. And she has concluded in her research that often environmental factors, including trauma, causes this change in the genetic makeup. She has a very interesting book called Granddaughters of the Holocaust, Never Forgetting What They Didn't Experience. And the research that she has done really is comforting to survivors, children and grandchildren, because they have known this. My friend who's a 2G named Elizabeth Rosner, she studies a lot about inherited memory. And she says, we have already known this in our bones, and in our dreams, and in our terrors. And she also says, we don't live in the past. The past lives in us. And part of her process is also one of healing. She calls it post-traumatic growth. We hear the term post-traumatic trauma all the time. And so she has changed it to post-traumatic growth, that in it there can be beauty and healing. I mentioned at the beginning that I wanted to end with a thought about reconciliation. And I would like to offer that one of the ways that it can be approached is by using the objects that I have been talking about. And I've decided to call them living artifacts, that musical instruments and compositions can continue to give voice to those who are now silent. They can become alive. And this kind of thing can be seen so well in the wonderful work of Violins of Hope. It's a project started by Amnon Weinstein. He is a violin maker in Israel. His father was a violin maker who fled to Palestine in the 1930s. And when other Jewish musicians were fleeing from the Nazis and coming to Palestine, there were many of them that were bringing their German violins with them. And as the atrocities of the Holocaust became more known, they didn't want to play these German instruments anymore. And some of them were even destroying them. So Amnon's father decided, rather than to see the instruments destroyed, that he would buy them. And so he began to buy them and put them in a back storage room. One day, Amnon was working in the shop with his father, and an elderly man came in and had a violin that was in bad shape. And the man said, I played this violin in Auschwitz, and I would like to get it restored. I'd like to give it to my grandson. And Amnon said that when he and his father took the top off of the instrument, it was filled with ash. And that was really a defining moment for him in his life, to realize that the chimneys of Auschwitz had rained down on this violin as this man had played. And so inside was evidence of what had happened. And so Amnon began to collect instruments that were played during the Holocaust and to restore them. And to date, he has over 80 instruments in his Violins of Hope project, and they tour all over the world and give concerts and educational programs. And the mission here is to honor the lives that were lost and also to bring awareness to the dangers of intolerance. The violin that I showed you at the beginning as part of the object collage has been on the journey to become part of the Violins of Hope project. It is the violin seen here in the hands of Max Becker. His daughter, Sonia, has turned his violin over to Amnon, and he has been carefully and painstakingly restoring it during the pandemic. This is a photo. I've seen a lot of photos of it on his workbench in different stages. So this is one of the photos of him restoring it. It's a very fine violin. And so when they travel again, hopefully later in 2021, this violin, Max Becker's story, will be given voice through the sound of his violin, a living artifact. And I believe that this violin is not only an agent of remembrance and resistance and resilience, but also one of reconciliation. Thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Kelly. I've got a question for you.
Okay.
So, and by the way, if anybody wants to put a question in chat, you'll feel free to do that. I'll monitor that. But have they played some of the compositions? I'm particularly curious about Alma's work that included so many different odd instruments. Have they ever recreated any of those compositions with those instruments?
No, they weren't able to, because everything was destroyed in Auschwitz as the Nazis were trying to cover up their crimes. So none of that music from that survived. We do have the music from the vocal orchestra in Sumatra, and the Milligan choir, women's chorales, actually sang a couple of those this semester. So we do have that, but not the ones from the women's orchestra.
There's a few questions there. Kelly, do you see those?
I can pull it up, or you can ask them.
Yeah. Are there any other significant genocidal events where the music has been studied like the Holocaust?
Not to my knowledge, not to the extent that this has. Music in the Western tradition, and when we look at the long history of the German music from Bach and Handel and Schumann, and music was so important in that whole Western tradition, and then such an important part of the Jewish tradition as well. And so I think that's one of the reasons why music plays such a big role in the Holocaust.
And another question is, which musician do you relate to the most and why?
I usually say that it's Alma Rose. She's the first person's story that I learned as part of my research. And when I first read about her, of course, I was interested in her because she was a violinist, and because she was from Vienna, and because her uncle was Gustav Mahler, the famous composer. So everything about her appealed to me, and she was this elegant, sophisticated musician, and so I really connected to her. And at that time, I wasn't thinking that I would be doing any of this kind of research, but it was really her life that fascinated me so much that I wanted to see other stories of people, and began to look at her work in the Auschwitz Orchestra, and that led me to more names. And so that's kind of how it all started. So I have to always think about Alma as the beginning of this journey that I've been on.
And another one, how has this research helped you find sustenance during COVID? Can music be of help to us?
It can. I think, as I said earlier, that music is really powerful. And, you know, we all experience music in that way, whether it's music in a worship service or whether it's music in a funeral or in a wedding. Music touches us in a very deep way. And sometimes music can reach us when other things are not reaching us. And we've seen all kinds of examples in the pandemic as people have made music off their balconies in Italy, as musicians have given us home concerts when they couldn't, you know, be on the stage. And so I think we've seen music play a big role in comforting people during the pandemic. You know, I think we can't, of course, compare anything that we have gone through in the pandemic with the suffering of the people in the Holocaust. But I think we can say that the arts help us in times of trial, and that music seems particularly equipped to do that.
Yeah. Here's another one. Thinking about reconciliation, were there ever any meetings or even performances between Germans and Holocaust survivors who were musicians during that time? And a follow-up to that is, has music become a bridge between them in some way?
Yes, there are examples of that. And it's been interesting to read about how this process works, because it is a process. Another part of the process is, what do you do about Wagner's music? Wagner was known to be anti-Semitic, and that his philosophies and music were used by Hitler. And so there's a whole process that comes to this, and what happens and how can you bridge. And there can be a whole research study about how music bridges different people of different faiths and traditions. It's been used as a cultural ambassador. Isaac Stern bridged the gap to China in the Cold War. And so it is something that can happen. It's a process, and it's not always easy.
Are there other questions by anybody out there? You could unmute to ask too if you would like. Kellie, while we're waiting for any final questions, where can we get your book?
Oh, you can get my book all kinds of places. Well, they have it at the Milligan bookstore. So if you're on campus, just go by the Milligan bookstore. But it's also available at all your favorite online outlets.
Very good. Yeah.
Lots of stories in there. It's always hard to pick out what few people I'm going to talk about. And what few places I'm going to talk about. So the book is divided, and each chapter is in a different place. So you go to a different place and meet the people and the objects there.
Well, thank you so much for this talk, Kellie. It's been great. It was a wonderful talk. It was very informative. And if we don't have any additional questions, oh wait, we've got one down here. Sorry, I'm about to miss it. Has researching for the book opened up any avenues or ideas for future research? That's a great question, Trey.
Yeah, it has. And I've discovered, you know, after I finished the book, then I discovered more stories. You know, there's always more to learn and more connections. And one of the avenues that I'm exploring now is more interfaith dialogue, and how this impacts my own spiritual journey with the people that I have met through researching this. So I am in the process of doing a lot of interfaith work.
That's wonderful. Any other questions? All right, well, let's all maybe, use our emotions on there or clap. We can unmute and clap and let Dr. Brown know how great her talk was and how much we appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Brown. Appreciate it.